Welcome everyone, and thanks so much for being here today. You're here at the Shout Learning Online Conference. We are really glad that you're with us. We have a wonderful day planned. My name is Jonathan Finkelstein. I'll be on hand to help facilitate and to entertain your questions and ideas and comments as we go along. The Shout Live online events are live because we want to hear from all of you. And that would be that's only possible if you jump in and join the conversation. So I want to walk through a few ways that you can do that with us throughout the day before we go any further. On the left side of the screen, there's a Q&A box. You're welcome to type in that box at any time with your questions, your comments, even resources you'd like to share. So feel free to do that. You can also respond to comments or questions you see coming in from others. So feel free to go ahead and let us know a little bit about yourself. You can type that into the box, and we'll start to see those in the next few moments as people begin to introduce themselves. By the way, we'd also be curious to know, we know we have people who join us as groups from a variety of classrooms and museums and elsewhere across the planet. So we'd love for you to take a moment and let us know whether you're logging in alone today or whether you're here with a group. We hope if you are with a group, you'll do your best to share some of your colleagues, friends or family or coworkers' thoughts as well in the chat box as we go along too. Excellent. Well, thank you for doing that. That's fantastic. A couple of other quick things I wanted to mention. Our day today looks a little bit like this. We are going to start off talking about the Forest Service, its culture and community. We'll then take a 1-hour break and look at the Earth from space, pretty literally. So you'll want to check that out as well. And then we'll go right into an update on the Smithsonian Tree Banding Project. And we'll then turn to a panel session where you get to be the interviewer. We're bringing back some of our participants, our panelists from all of the prior Shout sessions, back by popular demand, to give you updates on what they're doing and to hear your questions about environmental issues, concerns, and successes. So looking forward to all of these sessions today. I did want to thank all of the partners that have made Shout possible. The Smithsonian Center for Education and Museum Studies, together with Microsoft Partners in Learning and Taking It Global. So thanks to all three of our partners, and I know we have people from all three of them on with us today, so it's good to see all of you. Well, what I'd like to go ahead and do is jump right in and get started. I'd like to introduce Jim Deutsch, who actually has presented during the Shout series before. He's the curator and editor at the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, where he's helped to develop a whole range of programs and exhibitions on topics ranging from our current topic today, the U.S. Forest Service, the Peace Corps. He's done work about the Apollo Theater, the Mekong River, World War II, and the Silk Road. And he also teaches on film history at the George Washington University and has taught American Studies classes in countries including Armenia, Belarus, Bulgaria, Germany, Norway, Poland, and Turkey, and elsewhere. So we really want to thank Jim for returning to talk to us about an area that doesn't get a lot of public exposure in terms of the inner workings and occupational culture at one of our most important American institutions, the U.S. Forest Service. So Jim, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jonathan, and I'm delighted to be back for another Shout online learning conference. So I'm here in Washington, D.C., working at the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. And as Jonathan mentioned, I work as a program curator and an editor. And by program curation, we mean that I help develop different programs for our annual Smithsonian Folklife Festival. And in 2005, one of the programs at the festival that year was focused on the U.S. Forest Service because it was the 100th anniversary of the Forest Service. And we brought to Washington more than 100 different employees of the U.S. Forest Service to talk about their occupational culture. And I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about what we mean by occupational culture, which is to say that every occupational group, doctors, lawyers, stockbrokers, cowboys, firefighters, police officers, students. Each of those groups is a distinct occupational group, and as an occupational group, they have a very distinctive occupational culture, which means that they have skills that are shared by members of that group. They have a specialized knowledge that is shared by members of that group. They have codes of behavior that are shared by members of that group. So as a folklorist at the Smithsonian, I've taken a particular interest in studying different groups and presenting them at our Folklife Festival. So as you mentioned, we did the U.S. Forest Service in 2005 on the occasion of their 100th anniversary. A few years later, in 2008, we did the occupational culture of NASA, our National Aeronautics and Space Administration, on the occasion of their 50th anniversary. And just this past summer, in 2011, we featured the Peace Corps on the occasion of their 50th anniversary. So each of these organizations has a distinctive culture, and NASA was one of my favorites, of course, other than the Forest Service, because people who work for NASA, they talk in a very distinctive way. This is one of kind of my discoveries when I was researching NASA and visiting the different centers. You know, there's the Johnson Space Center in Houston, the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, but also the Ames Center, Langley Center, others throughout the country. But I would hear people in NASA say things like, sorry, I can't do the telecon this morning, but I'll stop by later for a data dump, then I'll take the action on that. So, you know, for someone who doesn't work for NASA, this sounded very curious to me. You know, I'll do the telecon, or I can't do the telecon. Telecon is NASA jargon for telephone conversation. Then they'll say, I'll stop by later for a data dump, meaning that, you know, you'll inform me what happened during that telephone conversation. And then they said, you know, then I'll take the action on that. NASA is a very action-oriented agency. And so they were, you know, that's just the way they talk. And every one of these groups has a different way of talking. I think, Jonathan, we do have some polls we wanted to take.
We do. We'd be curious to know a couple of things about either you or if your teachers, your students. So one question is about what kind of career paths do students or classmates seem most interested in, for those of you who are indeed in an educational setting? Or if you're not, perhaps you can look around at family members or neighbors or people that you might know who are thinking towards careers. And as you vote, I'm going to go ahead and I'll show the results, but I want you to go ahead and put in the top one or two things that you hear or see, or if you are a student, what are you thinking towards?
Yeah, I see that we've got several people indicating health or medicine, and that's one of the fields that folklorists have studied a great deal, to look at the occupational culture of doctors and nurses and people who work in the medical field. They have their own way of talking. Folklorists have found that doctors use this phrase, you know, talking about patients as gomers, G-O-M-E-R, and been wondering, you know, where this expression comes from. Some people say it might mean get out of my emergency, G-O-M-E-R. Other people think it might be a reference to Gomer Pyle, but doctors and nurses use this kind of shorthand jargon. Likewise, I see we've got several people indicated business or law. Lawyers have a very distinctive occupational culture. In the late 1980s at the Smithsonian Folklife Festival, we featured trial lawyers as an occupational group. And people were saying, you know, what are trial lawyers doing at a folklife festival? Because, you know, they seem quite the antithesis of when you think of folklore and folk culture, you don't often think of trial lawyers. But trial lawyers have a very distinctive occupational culture. The way that they select members of the jury, the way that they present their final summation to the jury, these are traditional. These are shared within members of the group. These are things that they don't learn in law school, but rather that they learn by being members of the group and by observing master trial lawyers. They then adopt these same methods. So those are some brief examples of different occupational cultures. So I want to turn now to talking more specifically about the occupational culture of the Forest Service. And we have another poll, right, Jonathan, asking about how many different types of jobs do you think are available in the U.S. Forest Service? So maybe take a guess as to how many you think.
And we're seeing those votes coming in.
See those votes coming in. Yeah, and I should say that I worked for the U.S. Forest Service earlier in my career. I was a seasonal forest naturalist working at the Chugach National Forest, which is in kind of central Alaska, south of Anchorage on the Kenai Peninsula. So that's one reason why I was asked at the Smithsonian to curate the program on the U.S. Forest Service, because I had direct experience myself. And it was really one of the better jobs I've had in my life. I've had, I think, close to 75 different jobs, but this one was always one of my favorites because I worked on board a ferry that was run by the state of Alaska that went between the ports of Valdez and Whittier through, as part of the Chugach National Forest. And my responsibility on board the ship was to point out the humpback whales and the bald eagles and the sea otters and all the wildlife that we could see from the boat. So that was just a fantastic job. Well, we've got the votes in, and the answer really is more than 50. There are more than 50 different jobs of what people do in the U.S. Forest Service. So I'd like to maybe talk about some of them right now. And let me go to the next, I guess maybe the first slide on our PowerPoint. Obviously, the U.S. Forest Service, you think about trees. And there are many different careers in the Forest Service of people who help the health of trees, which, as a shorthand, the Forest Service refers to these people as tree doctors, or sometimes silviculturalists, or fire ecologists, or just tree ecologists. But the Forest Service, there are 155 different National Forest Service in the United States, covering more than 190 million acres, which is about the size of the state of Texas. And most of these national forests have trees, and the Forest Service has lots of different people who are studying the trees, protecting the trees, managing the trees, in terms of measuring seed quality, looking at fungi, looking at invasive species, noxious weeds, looking at insects, all of which are interacting with those trees. Now, also when we think of the Forest Service, we think of different tools that are used to cut those trees, and these are all photographs from our Folklife Festival in 2005, where we demonstrated different ways of managing the trees. On the right, you see a cross-cut saw. In the lower left, a broad axe, and on the top is a chainsaw, which actually is in the hands of a chainsaw carver, Rodney Richard from Rangeley, Maine, who carves sculptures using a chainsaw out of wood. But the Forest Service has areas where they don't allow any sort of motorized equipment, including chainsaws, and that's where they would use that cross-cut saw that you see on the right, or the broad axe that you see on the lower left. And one of the other people we brought to the Folklife Festival is Warren Miller, who we see here in these two photographs. Warren is an expert in the cross-cut saw. He's from Peck, Idaho, which is northern Idaho, and has worked in the Nez Perce National Forest and also the Clearwater National Forest. But there's obviously a a part of the occupational culture is learning how to file and sharpen the saws that are used in the forest. Now, I should say also that for the U.S. Forest Service, when we speak of national forests, it's not just forests, but also grasslands. And the person on the left is Chuck Milner from Cheyenne, Oklahoma. That's in western Oklahoma, and he's a range specialist working on the Black Kettle National Grasslands, where he helps manage cattle grazing. Chuck, as we see in this photograph, is also a cowboy poet and a cowboy singer, and so at our festival he was there to not only talk about managing grasslands and rangelands, but also to demonstrate some of the traditions of cowboy poetry and cowboy singing. And that's also one of the great areas for folklorists, is this long tradition of cowboy poetry and cowboy singing, is that when there were actual cowboys, well, there are still actual cowboys today, but obviously fewer than there were in the, maybe the late 19th century or early 20th century. But when cowboys were moving cattle and, on horseback at night, when they were kind of keeping the cattle quiet, they would often recite cowboy poetry or sing cowboy songs around the campfires, and still do today. I lived in southern Montana and saw actual, cowboys on the range, and Chuck Milner is one of those people who works both for the U.S. Forest Service, but also carries on the tradition of cowboy singing and cowboy poetry.
And Jim, this is Jonathan. It's amazing to hear you talk about people like him and to see these pictures, and it makes people like Darren wonder what kinds of things can kids do to study to prepare for a job like that at the Forest Service, or for any job for that matter.
Yeah. Well, actually, one of our Forest Service participants was Leslie Murray, who is the manager for the Begich Boggs Visitor Center at Portage Glacier in Alaska. And I remember her telling me that she decided she wanted to work for the Forest Service when she went on a class outing in the 5th grade to the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in southwestern Washington, where she grew up. And she told me that, her best friend's father was a forest ranger. He took the class out into the forest, talked about the trees and the environment, and from that moment on, she was hooked. She just realized that's what she wanted to do. And so from that point on, is what she told me, is that she took every opportunity to just learn everything she could about forests and the environment. As I was saying about tree doctors, it's more than just the trees. It's the insects. It's the other plants. And so every opportunity she had, she would just go out into the forest and talk to people and try to learn from them. And then she went to college and studied environmental science, and moved into a long and really quite distinguished career with the U.S. Forest Service. But I think it's, even if you don't live in a place where there are national forests nearby, you can find people working for kind of your city or your county or your state who are involved in environmental affairs, and they may be able to advise and guide you. But really, you can do some research on the internet, but for me, really the best part is kind of face-to-face interaction with people who are in those jobs, learning directly from them.
Great. Thanks, Jim. And Darren, thank you for the question.
Let me go on to our next slide, which shows Heather Murphy, who's from Leavenworth, Washington, which is central Washington. She's a wildlife biologist who surveys, as part of her job, the birds, the mammals, amphibians, and mollusks in the Wenatchee River Ranger District, which is on the Okanagan and Wenatchee National Forests. Just hearing those names too, of course, those are all Native American names, Okanagan and Wenatchee. But Heather is she's not only a biologist, she's also an artist. And the way that she keeps tracks, or the way that she records the feathers and the tracks and the fur and the scat. You know what scat is? Scat is what is left by animals on the trail. She records the fur, the scat, the bones, the nests, the plants, and the organisms that she observes. She records them in her field journal. And in the slide on the right, we see Heather using watercolors to illustrate her field notes. So she came to the festival, and that's the photograph on the left is Heather at our Folklife Festival with some of her drawings in the background. But so if you are a wildlife biologist, you can document your findings with photographs, or if you have some of the talents that Heather has, you can document them by illustrating them with watercolors. Sometimes, drawing can be more kind of accurate and representative than photography.
And we're reminded of our first Shout session last year, and the recording is available on the website you used to enter today, a session we did with Alice Tangerini, who is at the American Museum of Natural History, and she is an illustrator, and just as Jim was just saying, her illustrations are regarded by scientists around the world as the definitive drawing of a particular species of plant. So an amazing career opportunity for combining science, nature, and art.
Absolutely, yeah. Someone else who came to our festival is Jim Hammer from Winthrop, Washington. He's worked, or at least at the time, he had worked more than 40 years with the Forest Service, and all that was in actually the same national forest as Heather, in the Okanagan and Wenatchee National Forests in central Washington. And he works as an animal packer. So we see him on the left, kind of in Washington, with animals that are packed, and the slide on the right shows him at our Folklife Festival with a plastic horse, but we use that for purposes of demonstration, and Jim's showing the best way to pack an animal, because as I mentioned, many of the national forests motorized vehicles are prohibited. These are wilderness areas, and in order to protect and preserve the wilderness areas, we do not allow vehicles that have motors. You can walk, you can bike, that is bicycle, not a motorbike, but you can bike in some areas, and you can use pack animals. If you're transporting a lot of equipment, and for some of the Forest Service fire lookouts, they need to build the fire lookouts in remote areas, wilderness areas, and they would pack the materials in by horse. And obviously you don't want to overburden the horse, so you need an expert horse packer, someone like Jim Hammer, who knows how to distribute the load so that the horse is not overly burdened, and distribute the load so it's not going to fall off, and it's not going to injure or harm the animal in any way. So just, again, one of the interesting careers that can be pursued with the U.S. Forest Service is horse packing, and in kind of wilderness wilderness rangers. Archaeology is another career that is practiced in the U.S. Forest Service. Not surprisingly, many of the national forests contain remnants of people who had lived there hundreds or even thousands of years earlier. Our Native American population that moved into North America from Asia 10,000 or so years ago. So these are two archaeologists, both of them from Arizona. On top is Kristen Martine from Flagstaff, and on the bottom is Neil Weintraub from Williams, Arizona. Kristen is a district archaeology at the Mogollon Rim Ranger District in the Coconino National Forest, and she also often works with Native American groups that use the forest or that have a connection to its archaeological sites. And as an archaeologist, Kristen is very much involved in protecting traditional cultural properties, and especially sites that may have some religious significance for the descendants of the Native Americans who had lived there. Neil is a district archaeologist in the Williams and Tusayan Ranger districts for the Kaibab National Forest, where he helps protect, manage, and interpret a broad range of artifacts and resources. And he has uncovered artifacts dating back at least 4,000 years. So, also one of the jobs that these forest archaeologists do is to discourage people, from looting archaeological sites. That's one of the concerns in the national forest, is that some of the visitors do not respect the archaeological sites and are doing things that are illegal and not to mention unethical. So, lots of archaeology possibilities within our national forests. Soil specialists. Obviously, soil is essential in maintaining the health of our national forests, and this is a picture of Ed Gross from Brookings, Oregon, who worked as a soil scientist in the Siskiyou National Forest in Oregon. And Ed, who's sometimes known as Dr. Dirt, because he is a soil scientist and soil specialist, and he was particularly interested in the role that dead organic matter plays in kind of the regeneration and the regeneration cycle of trees. So I remember when Ed was coming to the Folklife Festival, he asked us to provide him with lots of organic material, trees that had been cut down, or that trees that had a lot of dead organic matter on the trees, that he could help our visitors better understand the process of regeneration.
And Jim, I'm asking our fellow participants today what they think the most interesting part of the day could be for a soil scientist like Dr. Dirt. If you were a soil scientist, put yourself in his shoes, what do you think would be the most exciting prospect on a given day, the most exciting thing you might encounter, find, learn, or do? Take a guess. All right, as we wait.
It's a great question. And that's one of the, I think one of the pleasures of working for an agency like the U.S. Forest Service is that, every day can be different. And when you're out in the field, you'll encounter things that you might not have expected to find. So are we going to get some responses, Jonathan? Or?
We'll see if anybody, I think people are getting their minds dirty, thinking about what it might be.
Yeah.
But we do have another question that comes in from Ruffin, South Carolina. Dorothy wants to know, going back to the archaeologist job that we just mentioned, the forest archaeologist, what's the educational path that gets somebody there?
Yeah. Well, I can answer that question because I worked as an archaeologist myself. I worked as an archaeologist with the National Park Service in Arizona, actually not far from where Kristen and Neil were working. Now, this maybe is an opportunity to talk about the National Park Service and the U.S. Forest Service. Those are, I think, two of the more important natural resource agencies with the U.S. government, but we need to keep them distinct because the U.S. Forest Service manages the national forests and grasslands, and that's part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The National Park Service manages our national parks, national monuments, national memorials, and that's part of the Department of the Interior. But both are wonderful agencies. I've worked for both, the Forest Service and the Park Service. But I worked as an archaeologist for the Park Service, and my training was as an undergraduate in college, and I was studying American civilization was my major, but every summer I took part in archaeological field schools. My college, which was Williams College in Massachusetts, did not offer courses in archaeology, so I would spend my summers taking courses in archaeology. And one summer I went to the University of New Mexico Archaeological Field School, and another summer I went to Washington State University Archaeological Field School. So if your college offers courses in archaeology, by all means take them, but if it doesn't, then you can take part in archaeological field schools, or you can do both. Take courses during the regular school year, and in the summer, when there are lots of archaeological digs happening, you can take part in those, and decide if you feel archaeology might be a career option for you. And if so, I mean, you might be able to get a job after college, as I did with the National Park Service. You can also later pursue a graduate degree in archaeology. So it's a combination of education and then field experience of working in the field. But I think, all over the country, I know Virginia, Alexandria, Virginia, which is just a few miles from the center of Washington, D.C., does archaeology every summer, because Alexandria, being on the river, had both Native American and then colonial America sites that it researches by way of archaeological fieldwork.
And Jim, we've gotten a few questions in and a few comments to the Dr. Dirt question as well. N.G. Edwards speculates, well, maybe a soil scientist would find it interesting to find a unique species of decomposer or a unique nutrient concentration that they think might harm or help the tree and plant life. That could be one possibility. Michelle says, I don't know enough about a soil specialist day to guess at what the most interesting part would be. What does he do all day?
Yeah. Well, it's and I think those two responses, and I see we have also one from El Paso, Texas, where saying there's not much soil out there; it's mostly sand. But soil is so essential to the health of the forests or the grasslands. I mean, if we think back of Chuck Milner living in Cheyenne, Oklahoma, out there in the Black Kettle National Grassland. The soil is essential to the health of the plants. And so soil scientists and soil specialists like Ed Gross are constantly monitoring the soil, taking samples, bringing it back to the lab, testing the, acidic content, seeing if there's any change, because soil may be the first, changes in the soil acidity may be the first indication that there's something happening, that the managers and the tree doctors working for the National Forest need to be aware of. Actually, our next job is also something related, and this is an entomologist, someone who studies insects. And the person in the photographs is Nathan Schiff from Stoneville, Mississippi, who's an entomologist at the Center for Bottomland Hardwood Research. And much like soil, insects are absolutely essential to the health of the forest. I mean, there are beneficial insects, and there are insects that are not beneficial, insects that can spread, fungal or bacterial disease, or that can, sometimes insects arrive in forests where they are not native to the forest, and they will start eating everything they can. And then the entomologists and tree doctors need to find ways to control insects without using pesticides or chemicals that might damage the trees or the soil or the human beings who come into contact with those trees. But entomologists like Nathan Schiff, his work has brought him to 43 different countries, working with forestry groups, with various non-governmental organizations to address some of the problems that may arise from insects and trees. He's also a collector, and in the photographs we see, he brought with him to the festival his collections of some of the brilliantly colored butterflies and beetles. Some of the beetles were the size of a human fist. So let me move on to another occupation, which is bird bander. And the person in the photograph is Dennis Vroman from Grants Pass, Oregon, who's a bird bander at the Siskiyou National Forest in in Oregon. And although he retired from the Forest Service, in 1996, actually, he was continuing to maintain 3 stations in the Siskiyou to monitor birds. I mean, like insects, like soil, birds are essential to the environment where, to the forest environment. Birds are, I think, a very good indication of the health of a forest. If birds are active and are thriving in the forest, then that's usually good news for the forest. Birds, of course, also can help control the insect population, and then birds become food for some of the predators or larger birds that are in the forest itself. And bird banding is a way to kind of measure where birds are moving within the forest. That people like Dennis will put a band on the bird, which is a band that doesn't really harm the bird in any way, but it's got a unique number on that band. And then later, if the bird is captured or trapped, other bird banders or ornithologists, which is what we call scientists who study birds, can see where this bird may have originated from or where it was last banded by looking at that unique number on that is on the band on the bird's leg. So that's what people like Dennis Vroman are doing in the national forests. We move on to fire lookouts. Fire, of course, fire has had an interesting career within the national forests or within the U.S. Forest Service and national forests. That initially the idea was that fires must be contained immediately. And then later, some of the environmentalists and researchers were saying, fires can actually be beneficial for the health of a national forest by burning out some of the undergrowth or some of the other species that may be impeding the growth of the larger and more important trees. So the Forest Service today makes very careful decisions about whether to immediately extinguish or try to extinguish a wildfire or whether to let the wildfire just take its natural course, because for thousands of years, fires have been part of the natural environment. But in any case, the Forest Service needs to know right away when fires begin in our national forests, and that's the job of fire lookouts, people like Donna Ashworth, who we see in that top photograph. Donna is from Flagstaff, Arizona, and she has spent more than 20 years working as a fire tower lookout at the Woody Mountain Fire Lookout in the Coconino National Forest in northern Arizona. And what the Forest Service does is it hires lookouts like Donna Ashworth to go to, on the tops of mountains where they've built these lookouts, which is what you see in that slide on the lower right, where they live and work, and it's usually a solo job. Sometimes there are couples who live in the lookouts, but essentially you spend an entire summer, or at least during the fire season, watching for plumes of smoke. And if you've had experience like Donna Ashworth, you become an expert at distinguishing whether a plume might be the exhaust from the westbound diesel train heading through central Arizona, or whether it's the first indication of a fire. We have that folk expression, where there's smoke, there's fire. And that's what lookouts like Donna Ashworth do. And when they see the smoke, then they need immediately to pinpoint exactly where in the forest that is. So that's why you see that map in the slide on the left with the binoculars. So they'll use binoculars, they'll use maps, they'll use other tools to pinpoint the exact location of the fire. Now, the other part of fire in the Forest Service is people who fight the fires. And one of the ways that the forests, since these fires are occurring in very remote locations, many times these are in roadless areas, they have smoke jumpers. And smoke jumpers have been used for more than 50 years fighting fires. They jump out of airplanes and parachute with all their equipment on their backs. Their firefighting tools, their shovels and their Pulaskis on their backs, parachuting into fires. I mean, that sounds like a dangerous job, and it is. I mean, there's the danger not only of jumping out of airplanes, but the danger of being on the ground where there's a quite, dangerous wildfire raging. But and this is kind of one of the subcultures within the Forest Service. What we found is that we had, I think, 5 or 6 different smoke jumpers from California, from Arizona, from Montana. Actually, Missoula, Montana is one of the centers for smoke jumping, and it's just a real esprit de corps of people who are smoke jumpers within the U.S. Forest Service.
I can imagine it's the kind of experience, Jim, that unless you've done it, there may be few other people who can truly appreciate both the risks and the gratification that might come with a job like that.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, so the photograph on the right I like because it shows, we're obviously on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. That's the Washington Monument in the background there. And we had devised a rigging and where the smoke jumpers could demonstrate kind of how they adjust their parachutes as they're descending in the air out of an airplane. But yeah, it's... but they also demonstrated cooking steak on a shovel, because when they land in one of these remote areas, they may be there for days or sometimes weeks. They have to eat. They obviously can't. They don't have stoves, but they'll build fires, small fires, and then cook the steak on a shovel. They obviously clean the shovel, but hold the shovel over an open flame.
Amazing.
Something else that...
One quick thing, Jim,
yes.
Before you continue. I just wanted to invite people, because we're getting close. We have under 10 minutes left, and I wanted to make sure if people had questions, they went ahead and dropped those in now, so we have a chance to get to a few more of them. And I know we've got classes joining us from British Columbia. We have people joining us today from India and Nigeria. And British Columbia, if I didn't mention that already, and lots of points in between. So do jump in with questions or comments for Jim before we run out of time today. Okay, back to you, Jim.
Yeah, so just wanted to just have a couple, maybe 2 or 3 more occupations to talk about, but one of them, law enforcement. And we brought to the festival Jeff Bryden from Moose Pass, Alaska, which is in the Chugach National Forest, which is the same national forest where I worked as a forest naturalist. But Jeff came with his canine partner, Flash, a Chesapeake Bay Retriever. And Flash was the first dog employed by the Forest Service to detect fish and game smugglers. I mean, as I think many of our listeners know, dogs have incredible senses of smell, something that humans cannot even imagine. And so a dog like Flash was trained to smell people who were smuggling fish and game out of the national forests illegally. 2 other law enforcement officers we had were Pete Zavala on the left from Los Padres National Forest, and Bernice Anderson from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where she's a law enforcement officer and patrol commander for the Forest Service Eastern Region. And Bernice told me that, she said that a lot of people think that everyone who visits one of our national forests is out to have a very good afternoon or a weekend enjoying the natural resources and the scenery, and that's what we hope for, Bernice said. But, she went on, but we also know that at any given time we have to be prepared for the things that are negative. And that's the job of law enforcement in the national forest. So, some of our listeners may be interested in careers in law enforcement, and they're thinking, you do law enforcement in cities or urban areas, or you work for the county sheriff. Well, another possibility is to do law enforcement in the national forest. So if you're interested in law enforcement, but you also love the outdoors, then you might consider a career in law enforcement. I mean, the National Park Service has its park rangers and park police. The U.S. Forest Service has its law enforcement people as well.
And I just wanted to also mention, this is a complete side note, but all of these careers are pretty amazing, and I know that I could not have imagined that there were so many different opportunities. We have online with us our colleague Chris, who is joining us from the UK today, and he's been taking notes and capturing this conversation in the form of a picture, a graphic, a representation, and those of you who've been part of Shout have seen these before. So I wanted to just mention that after the session today, we'll be posting that drawing up on the site, so you'll have one quick reference point for all of these just highlights of the over 50 jobs that are part of the U.S. Forest Service. So let's hear a few more from Jim.
Yeah, well, just I think two more slides, and these last two illustrate people who work for the Forest Service who also express themselves in other ways. So the group we see on the slide is the Fiddlin' Foresters, which is the official old-time string band of the U.S. Forest Service. But these are all Forest Service employees who also get together and play music, and traditional music, and often their music emphasizes the importance of research conservation and public land stewardship. And similarly, our next slide is Angie Bullets from Fredonia, Arizona, who works for the Kaibab Ranger District in the Kaibab National Forest, but as a member of the Kaibab Band of Paiute American Indians, Angie also makes traditional cradle boards. So Angie, she works in technical services for the U.S. Forest Service, but also demonstrates some of the traditions of her Paiute Native American heritage. So just two of the many ways in which Forest Service employees kind of go beyond their kind of day jobs and continue the traditions or express themselves with music and art. And then the final slide just has a couple of websites that you may be interested in looking at. One of them, the first one, is our Smithsonian Folklife Festival. As I said, it's an annual event in Washington, D.C. So if you're ever in Washington late June or early July, you should plan to visit our festival, and you'll find information about that on this website. And you can also read more about some of the ways in which artists and musicians express themselves. Let's see, we got a question from Dorothy in South Carolina about Native American crafts. If you go to this website for inspirations from the forest, you'll learn more about Nathan Jackson and Angie Bullets and other of the Native American artists who came to our Smithsonian Folklife Festival.
Great. And we actually have some more comments coming in here. This one's from Barbara. In this economy, are there more job cutbacks now, and how stable would you say the employment outlook is in these fields?
Well, that depends on our U.S. Congress, and we all know that Congress is looking to trim federal spending, and that would affect all of these agencies, such as the U.S. Forest Service and National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Land Management. They depend entirely on their federal appropriations. So that is certainly a kind of an issue as to if Congress decides to decrease appropriations, then people will be losing jobs.
All right.
That's true for the Smithsonian Institution as well. We receive a very large federal appropriation. So we're all kind of watching developments in Congress very closely. And, feel free to contact your member of Congress if you have some thoughts on this.
Absolutely. Good. Thank you so much, Jim, for this incredible overview of the U.S. Forest Service, and got a sense of the kind of culture and the occupational culture, if you will, and the subcultures. There seem to be everything from smoke jumpers and bird banders, and the entomologists all perhaps have a strong connection to one another as much as they do to the forest and the service at large. I hope you found this a fascinating session. I know I did, and we'd love your feedback. I'm going to put up a little link at the top left, an evaluation link. It just takes a moment, and we'd love to find out what you enjoyed about the session so that we can continue to provide live online sessions that meet your expectations or exceed them. I did want to point out a couple of other resources that I think will be valuable to everybody here. First of all, you can keep following us on Twitter and on Facebook. That's the Shout Learning Project. So if you go to Shout Learning in Twitter at twitter.com/shoutlearning, you'll be able to keep up to date with all of the Shout Learning events, and you can even let us know when you find out about things that the Shout Learning community would like to know about. We're also on Facebook at facebook.com/shoutlearning, so we do hope you will check that out. I also wanted to point out that on the shoutlearning.org website, you'll find links to a variety of things, including an online teacher community with Microsoft Partners in Learning. We hope you will check that out as well. It's a great place to keep the dialogue going. You'll also find a teacher's guide that takes all of our Shout Learning topics and sessions and provides you with resources and challenges that you can tackle with your students in your classroom. So we hope you'll check that out and contribute back on the Taking It Global website as well, where there's a global classroom where your students can continue the conversation. So check out all of those resources. If you're trying to remember one place you can go to get to all of them, it's shoutlearning.org. We have a great day planned for you that continues. We will be turning our attention in 1 hour to a view of Earth from outer space, and you're going to see some images you've probably never seen before, and certainly not gathered together with the guidance of Andrew Johnston, who is a geographer at the Center for Earth and Planetary Studies at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington. And you're going to love not only the images, but the stories that you will learn about how they're captured and what they tell about the Earth below our feet from the skies above our heads. So check that out. Also, we'll hear from our friend Josh Falk on the latest update on the tree banding project. So whether you're part of that or not, you should definitely come, because it's not too late to be a part of it, and it's just really getting started. So we hope you'll check that out. And finally, we're going to wrap the day up with a panel session that puts you in my seat, and you'll be able to ask all the questions of our incredible panel that will be joining us from across the Smithsonian, and we'll also be joined by some very special guests, including Cheryl Arnett, a teacher, who will be joining us to tell us what's going on with her class as part of the Shout program. So with that, please join me in thanking Jim Deutsch for a great start to the day and some great insights into the U.S. Forest Service. Thanks, Jim.
You're most welcome, and it sounds like a great day ahead for everybody.
We're looking forward to it. Thanks for kicking us off. Take care, everybody, and don't forget we're going to post the image from our friend Chris, who's been busily drawing what he's been hearing today, and share that with all of you. Okay, see you in about an hour.